Hey everyone. Before we talk about the Persian Wars, I think that's what I said was next in the last video. I'm going to talk a little bit about Greek historians and philosophers and also religion. So if you want to follow along, just download the historians, philosophers, and religion PDF files. The Greeks did not invent historical mindedness. Other people knew about their own specific history, but the Greeks do invent history as a specific genre of literature. So that's really important contribution the Greeks made. The Greek historians, in addition to writing down details about history, they also developed themes about life. Universal themes. So Greek histories kind of have an epic quality to them. A lot of historians don't like this because when you read like a Greek historian like Herodotus, you're kind of like, is this really true? I actually like it because it makes it more exciting. Same thing with like certain Roman historians like Livy. Sometimes when you're reading them, they might not be might not exactly be how it happened, but it's also kind of more exciting to read it that way. But probably the most important Greek historian was Herodotus. He's nicknamed the father of history. That's really important to remember. He was widely read. He often quoted Homer and Hesiod when he wrote. He traveled all over the Mediterranean world interviewing people. He wrote an account of the Persian Wars. He based his history on what he had seen and what he had heard. Basically, to him, history was researching or investigating what happened. But for Herodotus, and this is kind of where modern historians don't like him as much, history is also the story of like how the gods intervene in human affairs, kind of cosmic justice or divine retribution. Herodotus believed history should tell a good story. It's not just about the dry facts. You want your reader to come away with something meaningful after they read history. Thucydides is also another famous historian. His history is usually considered more scientific. He wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War, which is kind of a Greek civil war. He kind of illustrated how human affairs follow the same patterns. Weakness invites conquest by a stronger nation. Power always seeks to increase itself. Necessity is the engine of history. Leaders have to impose their will on those they lead. Some of those are themes of his. A lot of modern day historians view Thucydides as more accurate than Herodotus, more reliable. Like I said, he wrote about the Peloponnesian War, which was the Greek Civil War, Athens and her allies versus Sparta and their allies. Basically, Thucydides blamed the Athenians for the Peloponnesian War. Basically, Athens was growing in such power that everyone else started being nervous about how much power Athens was accumulating, and that kind of led to war. Xenophon is another historian. He continued writing after Thucydides. Because of the Greeks, history, the writing of history is a key feature of Western civilization. It preserves the accounts of great deeds. It teaches lessons to one's own generation. It shapes how future generations will view events. So the Greeks really contributed a lot to Western civilization with their historic contributions. Philosophy. I kind of want to talk about some philosophers. Philosophy just means the love of wisdom. Philosophy, the history of philosophy is basically broken down to before Socrates and then after Socrates. So Socrates lives from 469 to 399 BC. He's actually going to get executed at the end of the Peloponnesian War. So before Socrates, you have the pre-Socratics, and that's just the name. There are a bunch of different philosophers. That's just the name. Historians have given them the pre-Socratics. After Socrates, you have like Socrates himself, then you have Plato, then Aristotle. So that's kind of how historians divide up Greek philosophy. The pre-Socratics come from this area, Ionia, which is basically modern-day Turkey. Some historians speak of the Ionian Enlightenment because these pre-Socratics had a lot of interesting thoughts. Basically, the pre-Socratics are not satisfied with Homer and Hesiod. Homer and Hesiod have a lot of tall tales in their writings, a lot of myths about the gods. The pre-Socratics kind of reject that myth telling, and they want to basically investigate nature based on using intellect instead of myths. So they use observation and inquiry. They do have some theology in there, so the pre-Socratics aren't totally 100% scientific. They don't ignore God or the gods totally, but they're more rational, I guess you could say, using the human mind to figure out stuff. They talked a lot about opinion versus knowledge. The physical world is a reflection of a deeper reality. The senses are untrustworthy because they give rise to opinions, while knowledge is the ultimate goal of the philosopher. Using your mind, not just your senses, to find out what's true and what's not. I got some famous pre-Socratics. You don't have to memorize everything about them, just wanting you to know who some of them are. Thales is probably one of the most important. A lot of these pre-Socratics wanted to figure out what the arche was. Arche is just a Greek word that kind of means like the beginning. What's the beginning of things? For Thales, it was water. For Anaximenes, it was air. For Heraclitus, change was the only thing that was constant. He said you can't put your foot in the same river twice, because once you've put your foot in, you've changed the river, and it's no longer the river you stepped in, it's a different river. Parmenides argued that change is an illusion. Nothing ever changes. Everything is uniform, everything is eternal. Anaxagoras argued that the mind is critical, perception is everything. Anaximander, sorry, sometimes these Greek names throw me off, he explored the notion that there's a single imperishable uniform substance called the boundless, of which everything is made. Pythagoras talked about you must pursue knowledge your whole life. He talked a lot about how mathematics and music you can find truth about the universe through them. Some pre-Socratics talked about atoms. Democritus was one of these guys, the atomists. Basically, everything is made up of tiny, invisible particles moving in a void. So there's this idea that, smaller particles make up who we are. Another group, these aren't necessarily philosophers, they're the sophists, or the sophists, that's how you pronounce it, sophists. Basically, you could think of them as practical philosophers. How should we behave? They were basically wandering teachers who would teach the artful use of language. So they would teach you how to argue, not necessarily teach you how to seek wisdom. They would say society's rules are not eternal, so you can flaunt them. It's more important to win an argument than to find out what the truth is. The sophists are typically seen as very relativist people, whereas the pre-Socratics are more absolutists. The three most famous philosophers out of the Greek world, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates really wants to understand reality. He wants to understand absolute truth. Socrates did not like the sophists. They did not get along. He asked big questions. What is the nature of goodness? What is beauty? What is courage? What is justice? Socrates didn't write anything down. Everything that we know about him basically comes from his student Plato. Plato wrote a lot down. Basically, Socrates' method was cross-examination, elenkos. He would basically ask you tons of questions, always trying to make you come to the conclusion that you didn't know what you were talking about. So he would get, basically you might say something, and then he would ask you a bunch of questions to make you realize that you didn't know what you were talking about. Plato, the next big philosopher, He founds the Academy in 385 BC. He spends a lot of his time asking the question, what is the best form of human life? He writes a lot. His probably most famous work is The Republic. He had this idea of forms. Forms are basically the perfect example of something. So, what makes something its form? Here's kind of a silly example, like what's a chair? What makes a chair a chair? Like armrests, backrests, cushions, sitting on it. I mean, you can sit on a table. A table is not a chair. So basically, you have to think in your mind, what's the perfect form of something? So the chair is a silly example, but you would use that to think about, like, what's the perfect form of justice? You can't really know what that is. You would just have to use your mind to think, like, somewhere out there is the perfect form of justice. So justice here on earth should look like that perfect form. So if I know what that form is, then I can kind of model justice based off of that. I got some clips here. You should probably click on these. They're like 5 minutes long. They talk about Plato's forms. The allegory of the cave is kind of an example of the form of him explaining the form. So watch these two videos. They're on slide 21. You just have to download it or click on the link and it'll take you to YouTube. They're 5 minutes. Do a great job of explaining. In The Republic, Plato argued that the human soul has three, passions: appetite, courage, and reason. So basically, the ideal society should meet those three. You need farmers to feed the appetite, you need soldiers to be the courageous ones, and then you need philosophers to use their reason. Basically, the ideal society for Plato had all three of these groups, but then they were ruled by philosopher kings who basically used their minds to kind of rule in an enlightened way. Aristotle, kind of one of Plato's students. Aristotle spends a lot of time observing nature. Plato was more of a guy who would think in terms of like the forms, like what is justice? Well, I got to think of the perfect form of justice. Aristotle was more like, I wonder why this happens in nature. I'm going to go out and observe it over and over again and figure out what it's about. So Aristotle is seen as more scientific, I guess you could say, than Plato. So let me switch over to the religion slideshow. I'm combining these into one so I don't have to make two videos. Okay, so now I'm on the religion PDF file. The main thing I want you to remember is, according to Herodotus, Homer and Hesiod are the ones who created a theology for the Greek gods. They give the Greek gods their names, they decide what they do, what their skills are. So according to Herodotus, Homer and Hesiod are the ones that you can credit with the creation of the Greek gods. The theogony, which you've read or you will read in this module, is just the genealogy of the gods. It just tells the story of how the gods came to be. So I'm kind of clicking through my slideshows really quick because you're going to read a lot of this. Hesiod is the author of the Theogony. Basically, the 9 muses come to him and they reveal the story of the gods. Hesiod is a shepherd on a mountain, and these 9 muses come to him and tell him the story of the gods. So you can kind of just skim through the slideshow, but you're going to read about it. So I'll kind of skip over the Theogony part. So slide 23, Hesiod wrote about the gods, their origins. Homer told stories about the gods. Greek religion doesn't have a sacred text like a Bible or a Quran. It's all about not having kind of dogmatic creeds. Faith is a personal matter. Religion is a public matter, and Greek religion was more of a public thing. Privately, you could think whatever you wanted to about the gods, but publicly, you need to sacrifice to the gods. You need to take part in festivals. Religion is more of a public matter in ancient Greek times. So read the Theogony, you'll kind of get an idea of what the gods are about. And I'm more interested in you reading the beginning of the Theogony. If you read the whole thing, there's like hundreds of names of gods and goddesses in there. It kind of gets bogged down. But the first few pages are the important part because it kind of shows how the first few generations of gods fight each other. So you can kind of get an impression of the Greek gods. So I'm going to stop it there. And next time we'll talk about the Persian Wars.